Welcome to Real Estate Resource. Thanks for stopping by. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you'll know when new videos are available. I really hope you enjoy this one. We're going to continue where we left off. And last week we stopped where we were talking about sellers remaining in possession, and we finished there. So remember, if it's 29 days or less, it's the SIP. If it is 30 days or more, it's a residential lease after sale. And the difference between the two is big, right? The SIP is, 2 pages really, and the residential lease after sale is a lease. So you have to really look at how that affects your buyer/seller in transactions where the sellers need to remain in possession for that amount of time. Ideally, what we would like to do is avoid the sellers remaining in possession for those periods that are greater than 29 days, right? Because it does make it a little trickier. Before I share my screen, did anybody have any questions about anything? Remember, you just raise your hand or type it in the chat, and I promise I'll get to you as fast as I can. Anybody? All right, well, let's share the screen then, and let's get going. So what you guys should be looking at right now, oops, sorry, I stopped the share instead of hitting the other button. What you should be looking at now is the RPA, and we're looking at paragraph 3M and N there. So let's move on. All right, so we talked about the seller to remain in possession. We talked about that. 3M3 is occupied units by tenants or anyone other than the seller. So in this case, if the property is tenant occupied, whether that be units or a single family, okay, doesn't matter. If that property is occupied by tenants, you have to incorporate the TOPA, the tenant occupied property addendum. It has to be incorporated into the purchase agreement. Now, it doesn't matter if the tenants are remaining in possession or the tenants are going to be out, if they're going to be evicted prior to the close of escrow. You still have to have the TOPA included. And since we're going to do that, let's bring up the TOPA so you guys can see what it says. So this is the tenant occupied property addendum. This is addendum to the purchase agreement because that's what it is. It has the property address, the buyer's name, the seller's name is going to go in there. The default of this form is the tenant is going to remain in possession. Buyer shall take property subject to the rights of existing tenants and under the terms and conditions specified in paragraph 2. That's how it's defaulted. So if you don't change anything, you're just including this because the tenants are remaining in possession. If tenants are going to be vacated, if that's possible, okay, then you could do property to be delivered vacant. The property, or if it's units and only one unit is, you could put unit 1 or 2 or whatever and what unit is, because the whole property isn't going to be vacant. If it's a single family and the tenants are going to be out, then it's the property to be delivered vacant. It's like that. If seller, after exercise of good faith, attempts to and subject to applicable law, is unable to remove existing tenants by close of escrow, or I'm always going to do 5 days prior to close of escrow, buyer may cancel this agreement, and buyer's sole remedy shall be return of deposit and buyer's reasonable out-of-pocket expenses for inspection reports and appraisal fees under the agreement. Or you can check this box, which says, well, total amount shall be no more than, so you could say, hey, I'm only going to, if I can't evict the tenant and you decide to cancel the transaction because of that, and it's your right to do so, I'm only going to reimburse you your deposit plus X, $1,000, $500, whatever it is. I can do that as the listing agent, as the seller and a counter. I can do that. As the buyer's agent, if I want to do, I would leave it probably as my expenses. If you want to maybe negotiate with the listing agent and say, hey, in this TOPA that we're putting, we're only going to say as that's $500 that you owe us, just reimburse partial. That's just a business decision for you. But if I'm a listing agent and I get the TOPA and I know I'm supposed to get it on my property that's tenant occupied, and we've agreed to vacate the tenant and it's a single family, so in most places you have the right to do that, then maybe you would like to counter if this wasn't changed to an amount that is more suitable than just leaving it as reimbursing the entire expense that the buyer has incurred as part of the purchase agreement. Or you could even counter and say, we won't reimburse anything. We're just going to return your deposit. Okay. So we went through that. And I would like to do that 5 days prior to close of escrow. You should always have the tenant, if the tenant is going to be vacated or the tenant is leaving on their own, it should always be 5 days prior to close of escrow. And I'm assuming you guys could guess why we picked 5 days prior to close of escrow, because that's the same time you should be doing your final walkthrough. So by that time, if the tenant is out, you can go do your final walkthrough, see the condition of the property, make sure it was in the same condition as when you wrote the offer, that there was nothing new that's changed as far as damages, that any repairs that were agreed upon were completed, just like any normal final walkthrough. So that's why we want to do the 5 days prior to close of escrow. We want to push that as much as we can, which means if the tenant needs more time to move out, guess what you guys are going to do? You're going to keep extending the escrow. I know that sometimes on the extension of those escrows, you have to stop because the lender's like, hey, we're running out of time. And those things are true. You can, then make a decision to allow the thing to close, and we'll have to put some stuff in writing. The question in chat is, what if the seller does not allow you to do the VP, right? The final walkthrough. I mean, technically they're in breach of the contract, but the only thing that you could do at that point as buyer's agent is tell the listing agent, okay, we're fine. Your seller is not allowing us to do the VP. We still have to close because it is not a contingency, right? So we can't do the final walkthrough, but we still have to close. So just make sure your seller is aware that now makes them civilly liable for any issues that may turn up with the property once we move in. And that's another thing that you as listing agents want to have a conversation with your sellers. The idea that sellers start to act like, well, I'm not going to let them do this or I'm not going to let them do that. If you're breaching the contract, it automatically opens you up to some civil damages and some other things, which means the buyer could sue you. So just keep in mind that we want to try to stop things from being adversarial. So prep your sellers ahead of time saying, hey, by the way, you're going to have to make the property available to them 5 days prior to the close of escrow so that they can do their final walkthrough and see the condition of the property, so that we won't have to worry after the close that they're going to come back and come after us and look for damages. Okay. So you can't force the seller to let you in. You just have to make sure that everybody's aware of what their liability is and what their recourse is if the seller is being unreasonable. Okay. So next section, if seller is able to remove existing tenants prior to close of escrow, seller as applicable shall disclose to buyer when the property became vacant, whether the tenant vacated voluntarily, and if so, whether seller paid the tenant to leave, whether seller filed a lawsuit to attempt to evict the tenant, and if so, whether the lawsuit ended in a judgment. Seller within 5 days prior to close of escrow shall deliver to buyer the names of all adult occupants residing in the property other than the seller that are known to seller, or the following are the names of adult occupants other than the seller that are known to the seller. So you can put with the TOPA already, if the seller's the one providing it, who's living in the property if they're staying in there. Okay. Even if pursuant to this agreement, seller remains in possession after close of escrow, no tenant shall remain except, right? So now let's say the seller lives in one unit, tenants in the other. You're saying seller's going to remain in possession, but tenants can't unless you put some tenants in there. The problem with tenants remaining in possession after the close of escrow, if they were supposed to move out, is if they don't move out, then you have to start that eviction process, right? You have to then evict them. And now they become your responsibility. It's not like a seller where the seller's like, I'll be there 3 days and then they move out. If the tenant says, yeah, I just need 3 days after the close of escrow, and they don't move out in those 3 days, then you have to start all that eviction stuff. If the buyer is the one, the tenant is the one that is buying the property, then you just check this box and it shows what unit is occupied by the buyer, and this tenant shall not apply to that unit occupied by the buyer. The security deposit, seller shall transfer to buyer through escrow all unused tenant deposits, if any, and all prepaid but unearned rents, if any. Okay. Tenant remain in possession. Additional terms. Seller shall transfer to buyer through escrow all unused tenants deposits, if any, and all prepaid but unearned rents. If any prorated as of close of escrow, seller shall disclose to buyer any tenant delinquencies. Seller shall credit to buyer for any delinquent rent prorated as of close of escrow. Now that's an option to put in. You don't have to agree to that. I would ask for it probably as a buyer's agent, where my buyer is going to take on the tenants. If I'm a listing agent, you may accept that or you may counter that and take it out. If you counter to take it out, you've got to redo the TOPA with the change. Okay. Government compliance. No warranty is made concerning compliance with governmental restrictions, if any, limiting the amount of rent that can lawfully be charged, the maximum number of persons who can lawfully occupy the property, or the ability of buyer to remove any tenants from possession. Buyer is advised to carefully read and consider the attached rent cap and just cause addendum, which may impact buyers and tenants' rights and obligations under the law. Buyers advised the local ordinances may also affect buyers and tenants' rights and obligations. So attached to this is a form called the rent cap and just cause addendum. This one confuses people when they pull up this TOPA because it says on here, tenant signature, housing provider, which is the seller, right? The landlord and the tenant. It has them sign. And I get questions all the time. Well, what if the tenant won't sign? What if this form that comes with the TOPA is now just looked at as an advisory between the seller and the buyer. You should have these as an owner, as a landlord, have this signed by the tenant that they understand as part of their rental agreement. You see this? The following terms and conditions are hereby incorporated in part of the residential lease or month-to-month rental agreement. It's not part of a sale between seller and buyer. It is part of a rental agreement between the housing provider and the tenant. So in this case, this is just an advisory for the buyer to read through the terms of what they can and can't legally do as far as being a housing provider and their engagement with the tenant. Okay, so these need to be incorporated. So that's that. The proposed changes, seller shall give written notice of any changes of existing leases or tenancies. So if something changes, once I accept your offer as the seller, and I have tenants and you guys are accepting it with those tenants, anything that changes with any of those rental agreements, somebody gives their notice, the rent gets raised, whatever happens, I have to let the buyer know prior to those changes happening. So if we're negotiating a change, prior to that change being put in writing, I have to tell the buyer. Okay. Buyer shall, within 5 days of receipt of notice of proposed changes, give seller notice of buyer's objection to proposed changes, in which case seller shall not make the proposed changes. So if the buyer says no, the seller can't do it because we're in a contract to purchase, right? Personal property including sale, complete list of all the personal property. That's it. Just, hey, what's staying and what's not. Seller documentation and additional disclosure within the time specified in the agreement for seller delivery of documents and subject to buyer's right to review. Seller shall disclose, make available or deliver as applicable to buyer the following: rental agreements. That's not an option. Now, I know that some people don't have the rental agreements, but if you do have them, you have to provide them. These next two are optional. If I'm the buyer, I'm probably going to request them. If the seller doesn't have them, then we have to counter, or the seller's not willing to do them, then we have to counter. This is the income and expense statements. We'll ask for it. Always ask for the tenant estoppel certificates, right? So there's a form for that, tenant estoppel certificates, where that has the tenant then answers some questions, and then the tenant signs and the housing provider, which is the owner of the property, signs. It's just to confirm information. who owns the appliances, how much is there a copy of the rental agreement, what's the date of the agreement, how much is your deposit, all that stuff. It's just so that the tenant is verifying the information that was disclosed to the buyer from the seller. So if you are a buyer's agent and you are including this TOPA because you're buying property with tenants in possession and the remaining in possession, you want this. So please make sure you check that box. Okay. Now, if a seller counters you and says we're not going to do it, then you have to make a decision as buyer, as buyer's agent, and your advice to your buyer is whether or not you want to move forward with the offer without knowing this information or being able to verify the information that was disclosed to you from the seller. Okay. Surveys, plans, and engineering documents, if they have those, they have to give them to you. Copies of permits that they may have in their possession, they have to give them to you. Structural modifications, you have to disclose to buyer any of those things. Like it's just like anything else. We know we have to disclose those things. And security deposit, an itemization of all lawful deductions made from the tenant's security deposits, if any, and a statement of security deposits remaining after any lawful deductions have been made. Sample letter, change of ownership, or security deposit allocation. Seller representations, unless otherwise disclosed under paragraph 11 of the agreement or under any disclosure delivered by buyer, seller represents that seller has no actual knowledge that any tenants has any current pending lawsuits, investigations, inquiries, actions, or other proceedings affecting the property or the right to use and occupy it. As any unsatisfied mechanics or material man liens affecting the property and is the subject of a bankruptcy if seller receives any such notice prior to close of escrow, seller shall immediately notify buyer. Seller represents that no tenant is entitled to any rebate, concessions, or other benefit except as set forth in the rental service agreements. Seller represents that documents should be furnished from those maintained in the ordinary and normal course of business, and the income and expense statements are the used by seller in the computation of federal and state income tax returns. So any tenant occupied property, this needs to be incorporated. It has to be. You need to do it. It covers a lot of things. It makes sure that the seller understands what needs to and what they're not required to provide. Makes it clear for your buyers also. It's funny because I get a lot of questions from I'll get a question from an agent. They'll be like, does the seller have to give us a copy of the rental agreement, or does the seller have to give us the security deposits? The answer is yes. But when we look here, it's all written out now and it's incorporated to the contract. It's an addendum to the contract, which makes it part of the purchase agreement, which is a legally binding document now that everybody's agreed to. Once the seller now starts to push back on the stuff that they've agreed to, if they agree to these things, now they're in breach of the contract. Again, putting back into the buyer's hands some kind of civil action, for recourse. All right. Any questions about the TOPA? Anybody? No? All right. Perfect. Okay. So now let's talk about the delivery of documents, the document times, the fees, compliance, that stuff. We're going to start getting into now some of the seller's responsibilities. What are buyers? How would he negotiate those things? First up, seller delivery of documents. We talked about this last week when we were talking about time periods, that if I'm shortening the time periods for my investigation period, if I'm shortening those time periods, it's only fair, or if the seller's asking me to shorten those time periods, it's only fair that I request that the seller reduce the amount of time they have to deliver documents to me so that it still fits within the time periods that I am agreeing to use and do my investigations during. Okay, Jesus, you had a question. Go ahead.
Yes, Kyle. And when we are requesting the contract for to the sellers, the rental contracts, and they don't have any, we still should be able to close, correct? We just kind of bypass them, or?
Well, I mean, you're gonna have to. My camera got blurry all of a sudden. I don't know what happened. I think it's because people were walking by. I mean, there's nothing. It becomes now a conversation with your buyer. Hey, listen, they don't have rental agreements. Do you want to continue? Yes. Okay, terrific. As long as I have some kind of, conversation with them where it's in writing, right? Like an email to where they respond or something in writing. Yeah, move on. You could close without it. It's not necessary to close with it. It's just if they have it, they have to give it to you. If they don't have it and your buyer is concerned about the idea of not having a rental agreement with the tenant that they're now going to have to take on, then they cancel and move on to something else. They have the right. If they don't want to cancel, which most of the time they don't, then as long as you have instruction from them to move forward, then you move forward. That's it.
And now me representing the seller, if I'm able to provide bank statements showing the constant rents of those tenants coming in into the bank account, that could also kind of work out, correct? That should be.
I mean, yeah. Well,
some
look,
type of documentation.
if the TOPA is requesting that you give them the financial statements, and you didn't counter that, then you have to give it to them anyway. If it doesn't require that, then you're not required to deliver it to them. You could, as saying, here's the proof of the security deposits I have for these tenants, and here's the proof of the rents that they pay, because I don't have a rental agreement. But if there's no rental agreement, then the tenant estoppel certificate is like mandatory, because now you're just going off of what the seller is telling you, and you want to make sure that the tenants and the sellers are on the same page. And if they're not, and sometimes the reason that most of the time sellers and listing agents don't want to get the estoppels is because they don't trust the tenants. Think the tenants are going to say something that's not true. Okay, well, if the tenant says something that isn't true, it still leads to the idea that we have to investigate. And if that's the case, if I have a tenant that lies about what they're owed and what they're doing, then me as buyer, do I want to move forward with a tenant like that? So the tenant estoppels are required. That's it. I mean, you have to do those. I mean,
Try to get them.
they should be.
Thank you.
All right. I've had buyers provide rental agreements and stuff. I've had buyers provide rental agreement and estoppels. I don't understand that statement. I don't know how the buyer could. Sellers, yeah, of course, you should have the sellers. I'm not saying they don't have to. You should do it. I'm just saying if the TOPA is not checked off, right, that says they're gonna provide. Well, I'm not rental agreements are not an option. You have to provide the rental agreements. You have estoppels only if you've checked that box on the TOPA. So, but yeah, of course you should. You should always rental agreements, estoppels always. Like that's a conversation you should be having with your sellers. Okay, so the delivery of documents, make that time make sense, because all of those documents that are that they have to provide, and we'll go through those on 14A. You have the time to go through those in your investigation as buyers. So make it make sense, right? If my investigation period is 10 days and they have 7 days to deliver and they don't deliver to day 7, that gives only me 3 days to review the documents before I'm required to remove my contingency. Because remember, it's the original contingency period or 5 days, whichever is greater, if the seller delivers them late. So as long as if we allow the seller to say it's 7 days, right, and our contingency period ends in 10 days, we still have to remove our contingencies if the seller provides everything in 7 days. It's not like that 5 days doesn't just exist. It's not just like 5 days from receipt always. No, it's your original contingency period or 5 days if the seller is late in delivering those items. So the earlier, the better that we get them to deliver those items, the better, it gives us time to review them during our investigation period. So please be aware of that and adjust those time periods. Sign and return escrow holder provisions and instructions. It's 5 days after delivery. So for example, if I'm a seller, I've gotten escrow instructions. If I received escrow instructions, chances are the buyer has already received them also. I can check with escrow at day 5 after receipt of those and say, hey, has the buyer returned their escrow instructions yet? And if they say no, I can send a notice to perform in regard to that contractual obligation. And if they don't return the escrow instructions, I can cancel. Okay. So keep track of those time periods. 3N3, time to pay fees for ordering HOA documents. 3 days after acceptance, right? That's for the seller because they're saying the seller is the one's going to be ordering those HOA docs. We all know that escrow is the one that orders it, and they generally won't order until the deposit is in escrow because they want to have some money there. So they pull the money out of the deposit to pay for the order of those HOA docs. The sooner the deposit gets in, the sooner those HOA ducts get ordered. So that 3 days after acceptance is a bit squishy, and you're probably not going to get those ordered in that and pay those fees in that time just because of deposits. Seller to install smoke detectors, carbon monoxide detectors, and water heater bracing. So that never used to exist. That's a newer thing that came in a couple years ago. And the reason for that is because if the water heater's not braced properly, if the smoke alarms aren't installed correctly or at all, if the carbon monoxide detectors are not installed properly or at all, when the buyer does their appraisal, what's going to happen? The appraiser is going to call those things out. And when appraisers call those things out to get repaired, the majority of the time, they have to come back out to do a reinspection to make sure that those things have been remedied, right? Along with whatever other repairs that they call for. So if the seller does not do these things in the first 7 days, and the appraisal comes out and looks at that and says, hey, these things need to be repaired. One of the things that was added to this contract at the same time is that if there is any reinspection fee, the seller is responsible for that. And I think most of the time as listing agents, we don't have that conversation with the seller to tell them that if there is a reinspection of the property because the appraiser had to come back because of things that we failed to do, you're going to have to pay for it. So making sure that this is done during that time is important to make sure that you don't take on the liability of those reinspection fees. Now, if you're a good listing agent and you see that you're not sure that the carbon monoxide is done properly or that the water heater isn't strapped properly, and again, we're not contractors, we're not plumbers, we're not fire marshals, but it's easy to figure those things out is to call somebody. You can call the fire department and say, okay, this is what we have, the size of our house, the amount of rooms, where do we need to place the fire alarms and the carbon monoxide detectors? Guide your client to do it, and do it as soon as you take the listing if it seems like it's not correct. Don't wait until you get an offer accepted, then you don't have to sweat that. Those are things that you should do as a proactive listing agent, is to make sure that the seller has done that. But the reason why they have that in there now is that they're going to do that is because they're trying to reduce the amount of reinspections on appraisals because things aren't completed in a timely manner. Evidence of representative authority, that goes both ways, right? And so, Jonathan, thank you. I saw that in the chat, and that's what we just talked about there. Get it done after you take the list, right as soon as you take the listing. Evidence of representative authority. So the representative capacity signature disclosure, we don't really need to use as much as we did previously, because on the purchase agreement, on the listing agreement, they now have a section for the entity sellers, right? Where you can put down the entity name and who's the authorized signer for that entity, right? So the corporation, the trust, whatever. But now, once we've agreed on a contract, on a transaction, as seller, if I'm an entity seller, I have 3 days to provide proof to the buyer that I'm authorized to sign on behalf of that entity. And same thing for the buyer. If I, as buyer, am buying as an entity buyer, I have to, within 3 days of acceptance, show proof to the seller that I have the right to sign, I have the authority to sign on behalf of that entity that's purchasing the property. So it's in the contract that you have to do it. So guess what that means? If I'm the buyer's agent and I'm representing somebody who's purchasing with their entity, a corporation or a trust or whatever the entity may be, I'm going to ask for their proof of their authority to sign from the very beginning and probably send it with my offer. And if I'm a listing agent, I should have that proof for my seller, and I'm probably going to send it to them with my counter instead of being late. Because anytime we're late with something, because it's 3 days and most delivery of documents is 7 days. So what happens is that listing agents just go, oh, I'll send all this stuff over in one package, and they wait 7 or 8 days and then send everything over. If they don't send it on time and I have a notice to perform and you don't have, I send you a notice to perform as the buyer's agent asking you for this and you don't have it, and I have the right to cancel. You lose out on a transaction. Vice versa, I'm the buyer. I don't have these documents ready to go. I get a notice to perform and I'm scrambling to get the correct documents. I could lose my transaction because I didn't have it. So prep ahead of time. Okay. All right. Any questions on 3M through N before I move on? No. All right. All right. So 3P, paragraph 3P, items included and excluded. So the items that are listed on here are not normally included items except for bathroom mirrors, unless they're put into the exclusion items. Those are defaulted checked off because there was too many times people were taking the mirrors from the bathroom. So what they've done now is they've made them automatically included bathroom mirrors. I can't uncheck it. Okay. So they've turned them into a fixture basically. So in this case, items included, if I include something on here, that means it is staying with the property because it was personal property to begin with, and we're now including it. If I am a buyer's agent writing an offer, and we talk about strength of offer all the time, and the MLS says stove is staying, refrigerator staying, washer and dryer staying, whatever it is, check it off in the offer. Now, if you don't want it, say, hey, like we don't want these things, then you don't just leave it off the offer. In your conversations with the buyer's agent or with the listing agent and email communications, you can put in there, we specifically left off these items because we don't want the seller to leave them behind. Now, if the counter comes back and says, no, you got to take it like this, then you have to make a choice as buyer and buyer's agent. Do we want to move forward knowing that they're going to leave these items behind? And I don't want them and I have to deal with them. Okay. So these are personal items that are included. If you are a listing agent and you receive an offer where you know that the stove and the refrigerator and the washer and dryer are going to stay because your seller's already said they're staying, I'm not taking those with me, and you get an offer without those items checked, you must counter that those items are going to be included. Okay. So don't ignore this section. The other thing is, don't just go checking boxes just to check boxes. Okay. Like, don't go checking boxes just to check boxes. I see that too, where sometimes people just go check happy and they're just checking off all these boxes for things to remain. Okay. Follow what the terms of the MLS. Now, if you're requesting something that wasn't seen in the MLS, that's fine. That's part of negotiation. But know that as listing agent, you've got to counter any of those items that either weren't included on this list that you wanted or were included that you didn't. Can you keep the items no one want, like give them to someone and need to proceed with the sale? Well, the seller can do whatever they want with these items. So let's say, for example, the seller is saying, I'm leaving the refrigerator and the washer and dryer. And the buyer's like, I don't want it. And the seller's like, fine, okay, we'll go through the transaction with leaving it. If during the sale of the house, the seller wants to give away those items, absolutely, they own them. These items are personal property items, so people could do with whatever they want. Now, if I'm the buyer and I take on I say, okay, fine, I'll take it with these things remaining in the property, then throw it out when I move in. You can do whatever else. It's mine now. It's personal property. What about built-in stovetops? The built-in stovetops are a fixture. Those remain. Anything that's built in is a fixture. Now we're going to talk about that's what the items excluded we're talking about items that are required to stay with the property that we're asking that they be allowed to be removed as part of the sale. So as we go down to when we get into it at paragraph 9, it's going to have a list of all the majority of the things that are fixtures and are going to stay. So what you want to look at as far as things that are going to remain no matter what are built-in things, light fixtures, plumbing fixtures, trees and flowers that are planted in the ground. Those are fixtures, right? Things that are attached to the property. Now, I know most people now are mounting their televisions and their audio equipment, right? So they have like surround sound. They have things that are mounted. Those mounted items, even though they are affixed to the wall like a light fixture would be, they're not required to stay with the property. Okay. Even the brackets are not required to stay with the property. So if I have my TV mounted, and yeah, I get to take my TV. Obviously, you're not. I'm not required to leave you my TV. It is not a fixture. But I take my TV off the wall. I'm also allowed to take that TV mount. I don't have to leave you that mount. Also, but a built-in microwave, right? Like we've seen as you know, where they're above the stove and they're the fan and the whole thing, that has to stay. Any built-in ovens, you see those dual ovens that are built into the cabinets, those are required to stay. Those countertop burners, right, those are required to stay. Even if a refrigerator may have originally been a private, like a personal property refrigerator where you just move it in, if the cabinets around it were built custom to the size of that refrigerator, an argument could be made that that refrigerator is required to stay now. Okay. Do they have to cover the holes? They have to. They should fill the holes. They're not required to paint. Okay, they don't have to fix the wall. All they have to do is they just have to patch the hole. They don't have to paint. They don't have to do anything when they're removing brackets or things like that. Okay, so this is if, for example, I want to keep a light fixture of a ceiling fan, something that would normally be a fixture and stay with the property. I have to put in here that it's being excluded. If these things that would normally be taken and I want to leave them, I have to make sure that I'm checking off the box. Okay. Now, dishwashers are always, like 99% of the time, are built-ins. There are portable dishwashers, but if you guys ever run into one, please let me know. Take a picture and send it to me, because very rarely do they exist. So the chances are the dishwasher that's in the property is a fixture. You don't have to check off that it's staying. Okay. All right. Questions about items included or excluded. And we'll get into more detail on that when we get into the items that are included. Just so a reminder for all of you guys, any window coverings are a fixture. Drapes, blinds, shutters, curtain rods, anything that goes over the windows, those are fixtures. They stay. Make sure your sellers are aware of that. Okay, moving on. Allocation of cost. Now, this is who's paying for what. 3Q1, natural hazard zone disclosure report, including tax information. Always seller. Okay. We're going to ask for the environmental. They do have a tax one that you could ask for, right, for the taxes, but at least get the environmental. This is where you're going to ask for the company. You could either provide it by seller's choice, or you could ask for your company. Again, most of the time, sellers are going to counter you anyway. If you ask for your company, if you want to just kind of try to have a smoother offer, stronger offer, seller's choice. NHD companies are pretty much equal. Some are better than others in what they do in their reports, and their bonding coverage, right? Their insurance coverage. So if there is a problem with it, they're able to help compensate people for issues that come up from the NHD reports. So just kind of, most people use the same ones, right? Very reputable NHD companies, but this is a required form. So you have to provide it. Now, here's the thing. This is what I would, okay, well, let's go back. Let me change that. The NHD report that we all, 99.9% of us use from a third-party company is a replacement to a form called the Natural Hazard Disclosure Statement. The Natural Hazard Disclosure Statement is a CAR form that the seller fills out about, are you aware of any seismic zone, fire zones, flood zones, right? The stuff that NHD report will give you, the seller is now taking responsibility of saying, are you aware of these things? That's the form that is required to be delivered. The problem is most sellers have no idea what the hazards really are. Like, is it a high fire zone or not? They don't have any idea. So what we do is we have that form replaced by a third-party company that then protects the seller and does provide the NHD information that is required from that NHD statement. So technically this report isn't required, just that form is, but this is replacing that for the seller, so it protects the seller better. If the seller chooses not to pay for it, and this is just more of like a weird gray area. So we look at it and say, okay, the seller is not going to provide the energy statement. We know that. But now the seller says, I want the buyer to pay for the NHD report. Now, buyer pays for the NHD report. NHD report comes in. Could there be an argument made that the seller didn't actually provide that report because the buyer is the one who paid for it? I just feel like, especially with the statutory disclosures, which is the NHD is one of them, you want to impress upon your seller that it's important that they be the one to pay for it and deliver it. Okay. And if your seller is adamant that they won't, leave it alone as seller and you credit your buyer or you credit your seller and pay for it yourself, but let it come from the seller. Let the contract state that the seller is the one that provided it. In the chat, window ACs, fixtures. Yes, if the window was modified for the air conditioning unit. If there was no modification made to the window, meaning it's just the window closed and that's it, then no, it's not a fixture. Okay. If they modified the window, which some people have to do, right? They put wood in, they do some other things. Yes. Those window ACs, also sometimes people cut a hole in the wall and put the ACs through the wall. That then is a fixture and it has to remain. Okay. All right. So NEC report, very important, has to get done. Do not waive it. Do not avoid it. And if you're a listing agent, try to dissuade your seller from putting that cost onto the buyer. And if they have to, if they're adamant that they're not going to pay the $80 or $100 or whatever it costs for the NHD, depending on your company, then you pay it. You pay it. Protect your seller. Okay. It's worth every penny. The optional wildlife disclosure report. So again, I like that they changed it back to optional. If you're not going to ask for this, then just put not applicable in here, and please take these things out, like delete that provided by if you're not getting it, but put the not applicable if you're not going to ask for it. Okay. So what this optional wildlife disclosure report is it's not the fire hardening disclosure. What this is it's another report that it gets a little bit more detail about where exactly the high fire zone is. Right? Like, so an NHD will say, hey, it's a high fire zone and it's based on a big, pretty broad area. This report says this is only about fire dangers, right? For wildfires. And we're going to pinpoint where this is really the high, this is less dangerous, right? And the belief with this report is that it's going to help with the insurance stuff. So far from what I've heard, it doesn't make that big of a difference with the insurance, but if it's something, and you guys could ask your insurance rep, hey, if I get this, could it help us with the insurance? And if they say yes, then it's something that you may want to request, right? Because especially if it's you have a belief that it's in a fire area. And for most of us living in Southern California, we start to get the ideas of, the hillsides and things where it's going to be more of a likelihood that that's a high fire risk. Okay. But that is not a required report, so you don't have to include it if you don't want to. 3Q3, these are any reports that you may request from the seller or that the buyer may want to have done that aren't normal. Like, well, here's the thing. This is what I would tell you. The buyer can do any inspection they want, and we'll get to that when we get to like 10, paragraph 10 and 14 and all that stuff when we start digging through it. The buyer can do and pay for any inspection they want to do on the property as long as it does not damage the property and it does not cause any government interference where there is no law requiring the government to do that. Okay. So keep in mind that if I want my buyer to do an inspection, I don't need to put it here. It's just a weird pet peeve of mine when I see this in an offer. And then they check buyer. I don't need to put that in. It's already in the offer that the buyer has the right to do that. By me writing in there, it doesn't do anything except for, at least in my opinion, if I'm a listing agent and I see that, I think this person doesn't know what they're doing. They don't know how to write an offer because they already don't know that it's already there. You don't need to do that. What I would use this for is for any reports that you may be requesting that are not normally the seller's responsibility. So the biggest one, and again, I like to always touch on this, is that people ask for this one. Right? They ask for that. They ask for the seller to provide a termite report or wood destroying pest report, whatever. They ask for that. Okay. In the purchase agreement already, it states that the buyer has the right to do their own termite inspection, right? We already talked about the seller. The buyer can do any inspection they want to do as long as it doesn't cause damage and they want to pay for it. That's fine. What happens now, and the only time, and I'm going to give you at the end of this, I'm going to give you a caveat to what I'm about to say. When we ask for the termite report in the purchase agreement like this, 99.9% of the time, the lender's now going to require to see that report, and they're going to require a clearance, which means the work's going to have to get done. Okay. If the seller, because the seller now with this, like just by providing you with the report, chooses not to pay for the clearance in order for you to get your loan, that means the buyer would have to pay for that clearance. Now, some lenders will allow you to then do an amendment to waive all of this stuff, and it'll and they'll still pass it through. Sometimes that doesn't work, and now we have a deal that falls apart because of requesting this wood destroying pest inspection. So if I'm a listing agent, if I'm a seller, and I get this, even if I'm going to provide them with a termite report, I'm going to counter this out of the purchase agreement that says seller will not provide termite report to buyer and will not do any repairs. If I'm a buyer's agent and I'm going to request this, I can't just request the inspection. Okay. I have to now scroll down a little bit, and I have to go down here and put in termite clearance, or right. I have to put that in here, termite repairs and clearance. I have to add this here because what I'm trying to do is now get the seller to agree to all of it, not just giving me a report, but giving me doing the repairs for me. And if the seller agrees on the contract like that with both of those items, then you're fine, because contractually the seller's saying I'm going to pay for it. And if the lender does require it, it won't matter because the seller's going to take care of it. So if I'm a listing agent and I get just this, I'm going to counter back, I'm not providing the report. If I get this and the termite repairs right here, right, I have to counter both. I will not provide the report and will not provide the repairs, because if I just take out this section in my counter, I still agree to that. The lender's still going to require that clearance at the end, and then it's going to cause an issue for us to be able to close the deal. Now, what I said was a caveat. The only time I would do this is if I had a VA buyer, because VA we know is going to require it. So VA do it, right? You were going to put it in and request it. And hopefully the listing agent understands why we're requesting, because it's VA. Again, this goes back to communication with the listing agent as the buyer's agent. Jasmine asked, should VA buyers do their own inspection or should sellers do their own? Here's what this is what I've always suggested. Even if a seller is going to provide me with a termite report, I am going to, as a buyer's agent, recommend my buyer do their own. And the reason for that, and this is where we're going to finish for today because I know we have another training coming up. The reason for that is this, and as listing agents, those of you guys that are listing agents that are on here, when you call your termite company or the affiliate termite company that you work with, as a listing agent, have you ever said to them, hey, look, man, my seller's got very little money. They can really only afford X amount, right, to do termite repairs. So help me out. When you do that, do you think the termite company says, don't worry, I'm going to make sure the inspection gets all the repairs that are necessary. I'm just going to cut you a break in how much I'm going to charge you for the repairs? No, that's not what happens. I'm not saying that termite companies do anything wrong. They just don't do maybe as thorough as an inspection. Okay. So I would, if I'm buyer's agent, do my own inspection. If I do hire a termite company to do my own inspection, do them the courtesy of giving them a copy of the report that you already received. Okay. So that they're, because all of those reports get submitted to the structural pest control board. And if for some reason the reports, are within the same amount of time, within days of each other or a month of each other, and the termite repairs are drastically different, it could lead to issues for your termite company that you work with. But I always recommend that even if I get a termite report from a seller, I'm going to do my own. Okay. And yes, absolutely, it is better to request termite on the request for repairs. And that's where I was going next is, instead of including it in here, I'm going to make sure I advise my buyers that if they're concerned about termites, part of their investigation and inspection period, they're going to hire a termite company. They're going to get a termite report. And if the termite repairs are something that we would like for the seller to complete, then we'll put it on the request for repairs. If the seller chooses not to at that point, then we have the choice to continue or to move on. Okay. All right. So, like I said, we have another training coming, so I want to give you guys a moment. So I am going to stop the share there. Does anybody else have any questions about anything? No. All right. I am of the belief that next Thursday we are going to finish this. I promise. Or I'm going to do my best. So I really appreciate all of you guys being here. Thank you so much for listening to me babble on about this document. And I hope that I'm helping to make you guys more professional and better at what you do. So thank you again for being there. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you again soon.